on the basis of the SAGE minutes which have been released, suggesting we could see hospitalisations in the not-too-distant future reaching as high as 7,000, isn't there a very strong argument that the time to move from Plan A to Plan B is now, or at the very least, in the next short interval?
Well, my biggest take of yesterday was seeing the Health Secretary talk about how we might need to ask people to wear masks in enclosed spaces, in the workplace, surrounded by Conservative MPs in their workplace, none of them wearing a mask. It just gives me the sense of the complacency that I feel is sometimes too great a feature of the government when responding to this. In terms of how I think this should be dealt with, I want the scientific advice to be followed. I think that British people have faced some real severe restrictions, and I think they want that authoritative scientific base to do that. I'm really worried about things like the anti-vax movement and how that is affecting vaccination. So there's a lot to do. That's definitely true to say that. But
just on the masks point, this is one way we explored it in some depth with Mr. Javid, because frankly, to some people, it does look a little bit confused. Would the Labour Party mandate the wearing of face masks in public places again?
Well, you've got to give people, for instance, in a school setting, I would give head teachers the choice behind that. I think it's having the tools in place to respond properly to this. But crucially, let's still focus on how we've fallen behind on vaccinations. Let's make that the priority again. Support the decision in terms of children, how that has been announced by the Chief Medical Officer. I think that is the right way forward. I'm afraid I think too many people think this is now over, and I understand the fatigue that people have. I think I've mentioned to you a few times that a place like Greater Manchester was in restrictions before the rest of the country, and that has not been easy for us. But we can't at this stage lose the gains of things like the vaccination programme. We've got to continue that message to people.
But just in terms of the pace of what is taking place right now, and indeed the messaging, and Sajid Javid said not that long ago that these changes were irreversible. Clearly, they are not irreversible. Do you think that people are ready to return to tougher restrictions, given Freedom Day, given the weeks of relative freedom that we have all enjoyed? Do you think people will do it if they're asked to do it?
I think the fatigue is there, and I think we all understand that. I think that's why the messaging from the government has to be clear, has to be consistent, it has to be very clear what would trigger that move to Plan B and what the status of that would be. And I think politicians need to lead by example as well, and there's a lot about how the House of Commons has been operating the last 2 weeks, which I don't think has been a good example of that.
Just in terms, though, of that which we heard from yesterday, what specifically would Labour do that is different to the Conservative strategy as outlined? They say, in terms of cases, we are relatively flat, creeping up, but relatively flat. And perhaps until that changes, would your party's position be pretty much the same as it is the government's? Keep everything under.
I'm happy with a science-led strategy. I'm not looking for division points that aren't there. I think many things I could say about how I feel the government's been complacent. I'm not happy, for instance, with the way borders have been treated throughout the crisis. Again, that's something that is well known. But I want that science-led strategy. I mean, we've been criticised at times for this, but we want the national strategy on COVID to succeed. There's no question of that. Where there is complacency, where we do criticise individual things like the lax situation of people coming into the country, that is about trying to make sure the government's response is as good as it can be.
As we are heading into winter, and I made this point again to the Health Secretary, we do feel like we vacillate sometimes between incredible optimism about what lies ahead and incredible pessimism. And where on that sliding scale are you right now?
I'm not sure I'd like to put it on the scale. I think there has been a problem, and I think sometimes the Prime Minister is directly responsible for this in some of the rhetoric that is deployed. This is a slog. I mean, can you imagine if the Delta variant, our vaccine resistance had not been what it was to it? That could have been a scenario. And I think we've got to, at all stages of this, just communicate that to the public, make sure they know that there is a proper plan in place, that it is being respected, that everything is being done. And I think these language like Freedom Day, it's not particularly helpful. I would also say again, and we're going to talk about this in terms of things like universal credit, I worry too many of the lessons are being lost, things that were introduced in the pandemic that have got us through it. The sense of, well, it's all over, we can just move on from that. That is not the right messaging from the government.